Hi friends, welcome to Houseplant Tips and Tricks. My name is Nick and today we're going to discuss how to pick the right soil for different houseplants. This series is sponsored by repotme.com. Get all of your indoor gardening supplies delivered to your door from one place. Repotme.com has practically everything you need for your orchids, succulents, and houseplants, including handmade potting mixes, planters, fertilizers, and much more. When I first started experimenting with indoor gardening, I would just buy a bag of soil all ready to go from the plant store and call it a day. And it did take me a couple of years to realize that different plants are going to require different soils to grow to their fullest potential. And in fact, most plants are not going to be happy with mass-produced soil straight from the bag. When you look up a plant's care online, you are more than likely going to stumble across the phrase, well-draining soil. Well, believe it or not, most of these pre-bagged soil mixes available at plant stores and nurseries are not well-draining soil mixtures. A lot of these mixes are made primarily of peat moss, which is not only not very sustainable as a product, but also not ideal as the majority of our plant soil mix. At its roots, a plant soil's base is going to be what matters most. And peat moss is just not it. Over the past few years, I've been experimenting with potting up my plants with coconut coir-based mixes, and I've truly noticed quite the difference since then. The biggest difference I've noticed, hands down, is how hydrophobic the peat moss-based potting mixes become in comparison to the coconut coir-based mixes over time. And by hydrophobic, I mean that the water passes right through the soil without actually saturating it. The soil is just so dry at that point, it's repelling the water off and just not cooperating. If you are very neglectful with a plant that has a peat moss-based potting mix, over time, there's going to become a point where you're probably just gonna have to remove that plant from all of that soil and repot it with some fresh soil because the soil becomes so hydrophobic that it's nearly impossible to recover from. Most of repotme.com's soil mixes are made up primarily of coconut coir, so if you've been struggling with your plant's soils drying out inconsistently, I would highly recommend giving Repotme's coconut coir mixes a go. And if you are interested in trying them out, make sure that you use code NICK to save 10% on any potting mix from repotme.com. When you're watering your plants, specifically plants that are on the drier side, if you notice a lot of air bubbles coming up from below the soil surface, that is because your soil is hydrophobic. The soil on top is likely going to look saturated, but if you dig down just like an inch below that surface, you are going to find all dry soil because it's hydrophobic and that water is passing right on by through the drainage hole, not watering your plant in return, which is a major issue. With peat moss, this is a regular occurrence. Either you have to loosen up the soil a little bit and give the plant a really good soaking in the shower or outside with the hose if that's an option. And while it's not inevitable that your coconut coir-based soil mixes can become slightly hydrophobic, it is so much easier to recover from in comparison to peat moss. But getting a little bit more general for a second, if you have gone soil shopping before, you probably noticed that most often you're going to see soil mixes that are geared towards tropical plants and soil mixes that are geared towards succulents and cacti. The main difference between these soil mixes is the soil amendments that are going to be present in the soil mix straight from the bag. So a tropicals mix is going to be more likely to have ingredients like perlite and orchid bark, while a succulent or cacti mix is more likely going to have some sand and stones in the mix. These amendments are present in our soil mixes because they're going to help give these plants a similar soil mixture to what they would be growing in their natural habitat. These tropical mixes and succulent and cacti mixes are a great home base or starting point when picking the right soil for your plants. However, they can be worked upon quite a bit to give your plants the best soil possible. Sansevieria is, for example, the common snake plant. I guess this is kind of a weird variety, but the plant that I have on the floor behind me here, the common snake plant, is native to Western Africa. And as you could probably imagine from what your brain might be picturing when you think of an African habitat from what we are shown on television and such, that this plant is growing in a very rocky habitat. So including some additives like sand or stones or perlite or pumice is going to be very necessary in order for these plants to thrive. Fortunately, Sansevierias are very easy plants to grow. So if you did pot these up with just a tropical mix straight from the bag, I don't think the plant would really suffer, but planting these plants in a nice rocky mixture that's made specifically for these plants is what's really going to allow them to prosper. Let's move over to a very popular tropical houseplant, the philodendron. These are semi-epiphytic houseplants, meaning that they grow both terrestrially or in the ground and on another surface surface, so perhaps the trunk of a tree or maybe the side of a rocky cliff, depending on the species. Epiphytes, just so we're on the same page, are plants that grow on another surface, but they're not absorbing nutrients from that surface, so they're unlike a parasite. For example, a fern or bromeliad or an air plant that's growing up on the branch of a tree or in like the nook or the crotch of like where the branch meets the trunk, that's an example of an epiphyte. So their roots are used to attach to that surface, whether it's a tree or a cliff or a rock or whatever, but they're not actually using their roots to sap energy from that surface. Philodendrons are considered to be semi-epiphytic because they grow both terrestrially or in the ground and on other surfaces. This philodendron is likely growing in a very loose, barky mixture in its natural habitat. So when we're potting these indoors, including a good amount of orchid bark into our soil mix is really going to help replicate that habitat. And when in doubt, add some perlite. Perlite, sometimes called sponge rock, is a puffed volcanic rock material that really goes the distance with our potted plants. If you were to stumble across a new plant that you knew nothing about, you did no research on its natural habitat, and you potted it in a soil mixture of like 2/3 potting mix to 1/3 perlite, I would be pretty surprised to see you have any issues with that plant right off the bat. In fact, if you're going to take anything away from this video, it would be that if you were to plant a plant in a mixture of 2/3 soil to 1/3 perlite, or even 50-50 soil to perlite, it's a much safer bet than planting a plant in just soil straight from the bag. We've talked a little bit about the different soil bases and soil types, but let's hone in on those aforementioned soil amendments. Perlite is definitely what I would consider to be the most important soil amendment to keep on hand at all times. As I was literally just talking about, in a pinch, you can always create a suitable good soil mixture with just some pre-bagged soil mix and some perlite. Just like all the other soil amendments I'm going to be talking about today, perlite is available on repotme.com, and I will leave it linked to my description below. And if you click through any of those Repotme product links in my description and you make any purchases, I will earn some commission. So thank you very much in advance. I do appreciate it. Similar to perlite is pumice stone, which works in a very similar way to perlite. However, it's coarser and going to add a lot more grit into your soil mix. So consider using perlite over pumice if you're potting up like a cactus or succulent, for example, that would prefer a coarser soil mix. If you were to only keep either perlite or pumice in your soil amendment arsenal, I would push you in the direction of perlite. I do find its usage to be far more universal than pumice. I also really love to keep orchid bark in my soil amendment arsenal. I personally prefer finer orchid bark for both its look and its texture inside my soil mixes. However, any size of orchid bark is perfectly fine, honestly, as long as you're using it. Bark is going to be most essential for including in any of your epiphytic houseplant soil mixes. We talked earlier about the philodendrons being semi-epiphytic houseplants, so orchid bark is a fantastic thing to include in their soil. Other aroids as well, or any plants that belong to the Araceae family of plants, like Chinese evergreens or monstra, pothos, syngoniums. These are all going to appreciate that orchid bark included in their soil mix. Horticultural charcoal is the last amendment I would recommend keeping around. This will add some texture to your soil mix, but it's more importantly incorporated for the cleanliness of your soil. Charcoal is often used in terrariums as the bottom layer. Since the vessels don't have anywhere for the water to escape via drainage hole, you put a little bit of charcoal on the bottom, and if there is any water sitting at the bottom of the vessel, then that charcoal is going to help stave off and prevent any bacterial or fungal issues. Of course, I would never recommend planting a plant directly inside of a planter without a drainage hole, but if you absolutely have to, putting a very small layer of charcoal on the bottom and being very careful not to overwater is going to be your best bet there. I would probably just drill a drainage hole, but if you absolutely have to, that's your way around it. When making a soil mix, any soil mix, just toss in a nice handful of charcoal in there for good measure. We always love to play it safe. Keeping these different soil amendments on hand are going to allow you to whip up the perfect soil mixture for literally any plant you bring home. And doing just a little bit of research on your plants, like where they're growing in their natural habitat, or if they're a terrestrial plant or more of an epiphytic houseplant, is going to answer a lot of questions that you might have about what the soil mix should be consisting of. There are obviously hundreds, if not thousands, of houseplants out there, so I can't just sit here today and list off how to make the perfect soil for every single plant. This video is meant to be a guide or a stepping stone in helping you to figure that out yourself. But when in doubt, 2/3 soil to 1 part perlite. It's never failed me. But that's about it for today's video on choosing the right soil for different houseplants. Thank you as always to repotme.com for sponsoring this series. I will leave any of the products that I talked about from them linked in my description below. And don't forget, you can use code NICK to save 10% on any potting mix from repotme.com. Thanks for watching. I will see you guys next time, and I hope you have a great day.